Okay. Hello. Good morning, gentlemen. This morning I want to speak to you guys about a psalm of David. And I want to get started by telling you the story that happened to me. And about 5 years ago, the church here had a soccer league, like a rec league. Does anybody remember that? 2012. Some of you might have been a part of it. I was a part of it. And they said they were going to have 4 teams, and they were going to kind of pick us out. And it was just, it was a co-ed, so it wasn't like a big deal. And so I waited on the field. I hadn't played, by the way. I hadn't played soccer since I was about 8 years old. So it was about 30 years before I had played soccer. So I said, yeah, I want to play soccer this year. My wife's like, are you sure? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And so I showed up there. I don't even think I had cleats on, but I said, I'm in. And they, just like any recess or any school, we lined up, they picked us off. And they kept picking us off. They're like, you're with yellow, you're with blue, you're with red, you're with green. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, what's interesting as we were being picked, I was looking, and April Burrell was the captain. I think Rodney might have been a captain. I don't know who else the other captains were. By the end of this, I'm literally the only person standing there. And I remember April going, I'll take him. And I'm thinking, you think? You have no choice at this point. And what was interesting about that, it happened about 5 years ago. That really affected me. And I don't know what it is, if it was the feeling that I never had before, because on the playgrounds when I was a child, I was never the last picked. Unless, were you guys ever the last picked? I had that feeling that I was missed. Did you see me? I'm over here, and I can't miss me. That you picked a 10-year-old in front of me, by the way. You picked a woman in a wheelchair, and I wasn't picked. And so I felt, at the time, a little ashamed and alone. I just was like, okay, and it hit me like a year later. It didn't hit me at the time because I thought, yeah, you're probably right. I mean, I'm not a soccer player, but I would have picked me. It didn't make it right, what happened. And I wanted something to make it right. I don't know what I wanted, but I didn't say anything. Well, this morning we're going to be looking at a Psalm chapter 26, written by David. And he authored it. And he has some of the same feelings that I had coming out of this psalm that I'm reading today 5 years ago. And I think it was more of this. It was possibly misrepresentation. Like, hey, you just missed me. Or, I just felt a little missed. So this morning I want you to remember this, though. The faithful loving kindness of God never changes, and that he can be trusted. David wrote many psalms. In fact, the Bible tells us that David wrote 76 of the 150 psalms. Did you know that? And he pours his heart and his soul into the psalms a lot of the times. And so Psalm 26, which I'm going to read in its entirety, goes like this. Establish justice for me, Lord, because I've walked with integrity. I've trusted the Lord without wavering. Examine me, Lord. Put me to the test. Purify my mind and my heart, because your faithful love is right in front of me. I walk in your truth. I don't spend time with people up to no good. I don't keep company with liars. I detest the company of evildoers, and I don't sit with wicked people. I wash my hands, they're innocent. I walk all around your altar, Lord, proclaiming out loud my thanks, declaring all your wonderful deeds. I love the beauty of your house, Lord. I love the place where your glory resides. Don't gather me up with the sinners, taking my life along with violent people, in whose hands are evil schemes, whose strong hands are full of bribes. But me, I walk with integrity. Save me, have mercy on me. My feet now stand on level ground. I'll bless the Lord in the congregation. Now David, if you know anything about him, he was the youngest of 8 boys, and his father's name was Jesse. And there was a moment in 1 Samuel 16 where Samuel, the prophet at the time, was coming over to Jesse's house with a cow, and they were going to sacrifice. But Samuel is also coming to find the new king. And so what happened is Jesse paraded his 7 oldest boys out in front of Samuel, and God kept telling Samuel, it's not him. Is this all you have? And he finally said, I do have one more, but he's only a shepherd boy, and I'll have to go get him. And Samuel says, go get him. And what happened is this. Samuel saw him and knew. And at that moment, God said, that's your man. He poured a oil over his head. And it actually says this in verse 13 of 1 Samuel 16. It actually says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David that day. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him that day. Do you remember the day the Spirit of the Lord took control of you? It wasn't long after that David had the boldness and courage to say he wanted to fight Goliath. You remember that story? And what happens is no one wants to fight. It says actually in 1 Samuel 17 that they were kind of waiting on opposite sides of the field. And for 40 days, the Philistines were like, send somebody out here. And the Israelites are going, we're scared. And David went out just to bring food to his brothers and some of the fighters and the troops. And they said, get out of here. He said, why is no one going out there? And so he inquired. He kept inquiring and said, I'll go out there. And they said, no, you're not. He said, I want to. And so he went out there and faced the giant, took a stone, dropped the giant. This started an incredible career for David. If you look back at Psalm chapter 26, we look at the first few verses. It says this, it says, establish justice for me, Lord. Judge me, God. Judge me, vindicate me, because I've walked with integrity. Look, I'm good. I've been doing good. But judge me. And so he's pretty honest with God, kind of like the Goliath incident, kind of like his life. He was like, bring it. He said, I've trusted you without wavering, God. I've trusted you. You know what I've done. Then he actually says in verse 2 something that some of us might be scared of. Examine me, Lord. Examine me. Put me to the test. Purify my mind and my heart. And so at that point, I think back to integrity. You guys know the word integrity? You know. You ever been told you had great integrity? You know, the person who possesses the quality that being honest and moral, that guy's got a ton of integrity. Decent, honest, just a good guy, right? Well, this psalm, if you read it through again, is a lament. Meaning, it's a little bit of a complaint like, check me out. I told you I'm doing good. Then he actually says in verse 3, because your faithful love is right in front of me. He takes us to this point. And I want to stop there and look at that. How often have you kind of said, Lord, examine me? Have you done that lately? I'm going to stop and say, you examine me. And I journal and I write down a lot of things. And when I journal, I write out the same sorts of things. I say, God, this is where I'm at. Would you help me with this? Dave was doing the same thing. And what happens here is, we bring back to this part where he says in verse 3, because your faithful love is right in front of me. Brings you back almost to the point where David was with Goliath, and he had God, but he didn't realize until right then. It was like an aha in the middle of the psalm. You're right in front of me. Your faithful love, steadfast love, covenant love, or loyal love are all in the same term. It's called hesed. It's a Hebrew term, actually. And there's no real distinct definition for it. It's called hesed. At this point, David was feeling God's steadfast love, and he says, right in front of me. But then he remembers not so good. If you look at verse 4 and 5, and verse 9 and 10, he says, I don't spend time with bad people. I don't keep company with liars. I detest the company of evildoers. And what's interesting is, he says, I don't sit with wicked people. I don't sit with any wicked people. And then he goes on to say in verse 9, don't gather me up with sinners. Don't do that. In whose hands are evil schemes, and he talks about bribery. David was so passionate about being examined that he just says, no good people. I'm always reminded of my days of hanging out with no good people. Do you remember those days? What we consider no good people? What are no good people? Evildoers. Man, I used to have lots of no good people in my life that before I knew Jesus, looking back, you think, my decision making What was I thinking? Trouble I got into. Wow. Or I was young, I was immature, didn't realize at the time I spent time with people and people loved me. And I just made bad choices. How about you? How often do you like defending your friendships and those you spend time with? How often do you do that? Remember this, though. The faithful, loving kindness of God will never change, and it can be trusted. Verses 6 starts a point in the middle of the song where he says, I wash my hands because they're innocent. Again, David's saying, remember what I told you. I'm full of integrity. I want you to examine me. I want you to look at my heart. And I have to realize that I'm innocent. And I walk around your altar, God. And he starts getting into this point of the psalm where he says, I'm proclaiming out loud my thanks, declaring all your wonderful deeds. In verse 8, he actually says, I love the beauty of your house. It's like we are here today at church. You want to walk into church. You want to go to church because you like his house. You like to be around his people. You want to be where God's glory resides. And he was reminded, David reminds us of the intimacy of God that we have. But verse 11 and 12, we look at the psalm. David gets a little risky, a little cocky. He actually says, but me, I walk with integrity. I told you that in verse 1. I'm walking with integrity. Remember, I'm the good guy. I'm the honest guy. I'm the decent, upright guy. But he kind of said, look at me. I'm doing all right with God. You ever had that feeling? However, David quickly adjusts that and says in the second part of verse 11, save me, have mercy on me. Save me, have mercy on me. It reminds me of the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. Jesus told this parable from Luke chapter 18, and he actually says, two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words, God, I thank you that I'm not like everybody else. Crooks, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. And he looked at this guy. I fast twice a week, I give to the church, and I give a tenth of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. And it says this, he wouldn't even lift his eyes toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, have mercy on me. It's kind of like what David says here, save me, have mercy on me. The tax collector wouldn't even lift up his eyes because he was so ashamed of what he was compared to what he was. But David tells us here, in verse 12, he says, he brings us back to the reality of the text and says, my feet now stand on level ground. Feels good that I can go through this and realize that my feet are on the solid ground, the rock on which I stand. He comes to realize through it all that God's loving kindness, his faithful love, his covenant love with us has been in front of us the whole time. He gets it. My final example is this. To portray the faithful love of God that's right in front of us, in front of you, that you might not even missed. You know the story of Jesus being crucified? He's hanging on the cross with two other guys. One of the criminals next to Jesus said to Jesus, insulted him and said, aren't you the Christ? Save yourself. Responding, the other criminal, one says, aren't you the Christ? Yells at Jesus. Looks over here. The other guy says, don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We're rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong. So he shouts back at this guy, and Jesus is in the middle of this. Then this guy says this, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus looks at him and Jesus looks or just says to him, I assure you today that you'll be with me in paradise. You see, this man was right in front of Jesus Christ on a cross going to die. Physically was before God. Physically was right in front of the faithful love of God. And he said, I love it so much that, guess what, criminal? I don't care who you are. If you're David, if you're me, if you're one of you guys, the faithful love of God never changes. From the cross of Jesus Christ to 2017, it's the same and it's always been. It's always been that way. So this week, gentlemen, I'll ask you guys to examine your hearts. David says, examine my heart. Purify my mind. Go to my heart. Go to my heart. That's where I want you to go. The other question is, what's keeping you from having complete trust in God? What's keeping you? What's blocking you right now? And what could God do with the heart that fully trusts him? I want you to imagine that and think about that for the week. Well, I thank you guys for your attention this morning. I appreciate your time.